The colony at the edge of known space was one of those places that most people wouldn't dare visit if they had any choice. It wasn't because the scenery was ugly or uninteresting, it was actually breathtaking in some ways. Vast red plains stretched as far as the eye could see. Jagged mountains rose sharply against a pale, greenish sky, and in the distance, strange, swirling clouds created patterns that no human eye had ever seen before. But beauty in this place came with a price. Every day was a fight for survival. The air was thin. The temperatures swung wildly from scorching heat during the day to freezing cold at night. And the wildlife wasn't just dangerous, it was almost alien in its cruelty. Creatures with jagged teeth, thick scales, and eyes that glowed in the dark roamed the plains, hunting anything that moved. Even the smaller animals, which looked harmless at first, could kill with venom or by sheer strength. Among the settlers, people had adapted. They built domed shelters strong enough to resist violent storms, and they created farms under protective shields where they grew food in soil that was otherwise almost dead. They worked in shifts, guarding their territory and scavenging for supplies that could be dangerous to retrieve. Life was simple but harsh. There was no luxury, no unnecessary comfort. Every day was a task, a routine, and most people had learned to accept the danger as part of life. Captain Elias Monroe was one of those people who didn't just accept it, he thrived in it. He wasn't born here, not originally. Monroe had been a military strategist on a distant planet, trained to think quickly, to plan several moves ahead, and to survive in impossible situations. When the opportunity to join the colony arrived, he took it not because he wanted to escape the chaos of his old life, but because he was drawn to the challenge. He was good at assessing risk, at predicting enemy movements, and at keeping calm when others panicked. The colonists respected him not only for his skill but also because he genuinely cared for their safety. On one seemingly ordinary day, Monroe was in the command center of the colony. The place was a mix of old technology and improvised devices, screens flickering with readings from outside sensors, maps of the surrounding terrain projected on walls, and communication devices constantly sending and receiving data. Monroe was reviewing patrol routes for the day when a tiny, almost imperceptible signal appeared on the monitor. It was weak, static-filled, and barely audible over the constant hum of the machines. At first, he almost ignored it, thinking it was interference, but something about the signal felt different. It wasn't just random noise. It was a voice, a faint, desperate voice calling for help. Monroe leaned closer, adjusting the frequency. The message was brief. Almost nothing, please. Help, they've come. And then it cut off. The words repeated once more, almost like the sender was struggling to finish the sentence before being interrupted. Monroe's brow furrowed. He had heard many distress calls in his life, but this one felt urgent in a way he couldn't explain. The fear in the sender's voice was raw, unfiltered, and Monroe, despite years of experience, felt a shiver run down his spine. Something told him this wasn't just a small attack or an accident, it was the beginning of something much bigger. He immediately activated the colony's alert system. Sirens blared softly throughout the domes, signaling a situation that required immediate attention but wasn't yet a full emergency. Monroe gathered his small team, a group of loyal and capable men and women who had trained under him for months. They were armed, ready, and experienced, but the fear and tension in the room were palpable. Even the veterans felt the weight of the unknown pressing down on them. Monroe looked at each of them, his face calm but serious. "We've got a distress call," he said, "from a nearby outpost. We don't know what we're walking into, but we need to be ready for anything. Move fast. Move smart." The team prepared quickly, checking weapons, securing supplies, and reviewing strategy. Every movement was efficient, practiced, and precise. They boarded their transport ships, small but heavily armored vehicles capable of moving quickly across the harsh terrain. As the engines roared to life, Monroe took a moment to glance at the colony behind him. For years, this place had been home. For years, they had survived storms, predators, and scarcity. And now, one simple call for help could drag them into a danger far beyond anything they had faced. He didn't speak his fears aloud. There was no time, but in the quiet moments before launch, he felt the weight of responsibility pressing on his shoulders. Every life in that colony, every civilian, every team member, depended on him to make the right decisions. As the ships lifted off, the landscape stretched out beneath them, vast and unforgiving. The red plains seemed endless, dotted with jagged rock formations and craters that marked where previous attacks or natural disasters had struck. The winds whipped against the ship's shields, causing vibrations and strange noises that made the ride even more tense. Monroe studied the navigation screens carefully, tracing the coordinates of the distress call. The signal was faint, unreliable, and every second felt like it stretched into minutes. He knew they had to move fast, but moving too fast without caution could be just as deadly. During the flight, Monroe's mind ran through possibilities. Was this an attack from raiders? Was it a malfunction at the outpost that trapped the workers inside? Or something worse, something he hadn't yet encountered in all his years of survival and strategy? He thought about the reports he had read before joining the colony, stories of hostile factions, creatures from uncharted regions, and mysterious forces that sometimes attacked human settlements for no reason. Most were rumors or isolated incidents. But the thought that any of these could be real and now affecting people just like him kept his mind sharp and alert. When they approached the coordinates, the first signs of trouble were subtle. Smoke rising in the distance, jagged scars on the terrain that didn't look natural, and an eerie silence that wasn't like the usual quiet of the desert. No animals were moving. No wind disturbed the dust, just a haunting stillness that sent chills down the spine of every crew member. Monroe tightened his grip on the console, scanning the area for movement, for any sign of life or danger. Then, through the haze, he saw it. Shadows moving with mechanical precision, strange shapes glinting in the dim light. He couldn't yet make out what they were, but instinct told him these were not ordinary raiders. As they landed near the edge of the outpost, the true scale of the destruction became clear. Buildings that had been sturdy and well-maintained were now smashed or burned. Craters pockmarked the ground, and scattered debris littered every surface. Monroe's heart sank. People were supposed to be here. People like families, engineers, children even. He called out through the communicator, his voice firm but edged with concern. "This is Captain Monroe. Anyone alive? Respond now." For a moment, there was nothing but static. And then, faintly, someone whispered back, "Help, please. They're everywhere." The voice broke, and then silence. Monroe felt the weight of the situation settle heavily on his shoulders. The simple call for help had turned into a nightmare before he even fully understood what was happening. But there was no time to dwell on fear. He had trained for moments like this, and he knew that hesitation could cost lives. He signaled his team, readying them for immediate action. They moved cautiously, scanning every corner, checking every shadow, prepared for anything the unknown could throw at them. Every sound, every flicker of light, every movement could be a threat. And somewhere in the wreckage, someone's life depended on them, someone who had made that desperate call, hoping that help would come in time. Even as he led his team forward, Monroe couldn't shake the feeling that this mission would test everything they had learned, everything they had survived, and that the simple call for help might be the spark that would ignite a battle far greater than anyone could imagine. The quiet, ordinary beginning of the day had ended, replaced by a tension that filled the air like the electric charge before a storm. The colony's fate, the lives of those in the outpost, and perhaps even more than that, now rested in the hands of Monroe and his team, and they were about to step into the unknown. As Monroe and his team approached the coordinates of the distress signal, an uneasy silence filled their transport ships. The hum of the engines was almost deafening in the otherwise still air, and every creak of metal, every small vibration of the vehicle, seemed amplified in the tense atmosphere. Monroe's eyes scanned the terrain constantly, his military instincts alerting him to every movement, every shadow. The landscape was harsh, jagged rocks rising like teeth from the ground, and occasional fire pits marked recent destruction. Even from a distance, the signs were unmistakable. Something violent had occurred here, something beyond ordinary human conflict. When the transport touched down, the first thing the team noticed was the smelling, acrid mix of burning metal, scorched earth, and something more difficult to describe, a scent of decay and chemical residue that suggested advanced weaponry had been used. The ground itself seemed disturbed, with deep gouges and craters marking where heavy machinery or powerful blasts had struck. Monroe stepped out carefully, surveying the area, every muscle in his body tense. The outpost that had sent the distress call was now barely recognizable. Structures that should have stood firm were toppled or twisted into shapes that defied logic, as if some enormous force had bent them like paper. Smoke rose in thin curling trails, and the faint light of the setting sun caught in the twisted metal, making it glimmer in an almost surreal way. Scattered among the debris, the first survivors appeared. They were huddled together, their faces pale, clothes torn, and bodies bruised. Some were limping, others sat frozen in shock, their eyes wide and unblinking. Monroe approached slowly, keeping his hands free but ready. "We're here to help," he said, his voice calm but commanding. A young engineer, barely in his 20s, struggled to stand and pointed shakily toward the horizon. "They came from the sky," he whispered. "Ships like nothing we've ever seen. They took everything." Monroe frowned. He had heard tales of raiders and hostile factions before, but nothing could prepare someone for the reality of seeing such destruction. The survivors spoke of a coordinated attack, a force that had descended with precision and intent. It wasn't random, it was planned. Buildings had been targeted specifically, supply depots destroyed, and escape routes cut off. Monroe's gut told him that they were dealing with more than just ordinary raiders. He had read reports about groups from the so-called Deathworld, a mysterious sector at the edge of space, rumored to harbor ruthless, well-organized factions capable of extreme violence, but no one had ever seen them in such force. The survivors' terrified whispers confirmed the worst. This was no ordinary threat. Monroe signaled his team to spread out, moving cautiously through the rubble while scanning for any remaining hostiles. Each step revealed more of the devastation. Crumpled walls, collapsed towers, and shattered vehicles littered the ground. Personal belongings, clothing, tools, even children's toys were scattered, half buried in dust. The sight was haunting. Monroe's mind worked quickly, cataloging the damage and trying to anticipate what might come next. He needed to assess the enemy's strength, understand their patterns, and predict their next move. Every detail mattered. As they moved deeper into the outpost, the evidence became more chilling. Marks of advanced weaponry were everywhere: plasma burns, deep gouges in reinforced steel, and strange scorch marks that seemed almost organic in nature. Monroe crouched to inspect one of the craters, noticing that the surrounding area had been burned evenly, suggesting precision rather than chaos. Whoever had done this had the skill and technology to strike efficiently and leave almost no trace of their method. This was an enemy that did not act recklessly. It planned, calculated, and executed with deadly effectiveness. The survivors' stories grew more detailed as they led Monroe and his team through what remained of the outpost. One woman, a medic, explained how the attack had begun just after the colony's morning shift. Ships had appeared on the horizon, moving faster than any human craft. They fired without warning, targeting communications towers, supply depots, and defensive structures. Panic spread quickly. Many tried to fight back, but conventional weapons were useless against the advanced technology of the attackers. The survivors watched as their friends and neighbors were cut down, their homes and workplaces reduced to rubble in minutes. The woman's voice trembled, but she continued, insisting that Monroe understand the scale of the danger they faced. Monroe listened carefully, absorbing every detail, every word. He noticed patterns in their descriptions: ships attacking in coordinated formations, ground forces moving in perfect synchronization, and an almost mechanical efficiency in their destruction. This was not a group driven by hunger or desperation. This was an organized, highly disciplined armada that had a clear objective. Monroe realized that the survivors had used the word Deathworld with a mixture of fear and awe. It wasn't just a name. It represented an almost mythical force, a power so overwhelming that encountering it could mean certain death. Even as he processed this, Monroe kept moving, his mind racing with strategy. The team needed to secure the area, protect the survivors, and gather intelligence on the enemy. They moved cautiously, setting up temporary defensive positions, using the rubble as cover. Monroe instructed some of the survivors to help mark safe zones and paths through the debris, ensuring that no one would be trapped accidentally. Every step was deliberate, every action measured. Monroe knew that panic could be contagious, but he also understood that careful leadership could give the survivors hope in the midst of terror. While moving through the outpost, Monroe's team began to find evidence of the enemy's methodology: weapon fragments that didn't match human design, strange footprints that seemed too uniform to belong to living creatures, and a faint hum in the air that suggested residual energy from advanced technology. Monroe studied each clue, trying to piece together what they were up against. He realized that this was more than just a local threat. It was an invasion, and the forces involved were far more sophisticated than anything the colony had faced before. As the day wore on, Monroe gathered the survivors for a brief assessment. They were shaken, exhausted, and hungry, but they were alive. He spoke calmly, explaining that they were not alone and that reinforcements could be called. "This isn't the end," he said. "We've survived worse, and we'll survive this too. But we need to act carefully. Every move counts. Every decision could save lives." His words were steady, carrying the weight of authority, but also a sense of hope. In the face of overwhelming destruction, Monroe knew that morale could be the difference between survival and annihilation. Monroe spent hours analyzing the situation, coordinating with his team to set up communication with nearby colonies. They needed backup, and fast. Signals were sent, but the advanced technology of the attackers had already disrupted much of the usual communication channels. Interference crackled over the lines, forcing Monroe to rely on alternate frequencies and creative methods to reach allies. Every successful message brought a glimmer of hope, but the constant uncertainty weighed heavily on him. He understood that the clock was ticking and that every delay increased the risk to the survivors. Night fell over the outpost, and the eerie silence returned, punctuated only by distant, strange noises that neither Monroe nor the survivors could identify. Shadows moved oddly in the flickering firelight, and the faint glow of the horizon suggested that the enemy was still out there, watching, waiting, perhaps preparing for another strike. Monroe organized patrols and rotations, ensuring that no one was left vulnerable, and he personally inspected each perimeter, never letting his guard down. Even in the darkness he remained alert, every sense tuned to the slightest indication of danger. By the end of the night, Monroe had a clearer understanding of the threat. The Deathworld Armada was no longer just a rumor or a distant threat. They were real, present, and capable of extraordinary destruction. The survivors' fear was justified, and the simple call for help had revealed a nightmare that could spread beyond the outpost if not addressed quickly. Monroe's resolve strengthened. He had been trained for impossible situations, and this was one of them. Every skill, every lesson, every experience he had ever gained was now being put to the ultimate test. As he looked at the frightened but resilient faces of the survivors, Monroe knew that this was only the beginning. The destruction, the terror, and the overwhelming power of the Deathworld forces had been revealed. But so had something else, the determination of humans to survive, to fight, and to protect one another even in the face of unimaginable odds. The first step had been taken by a single, desperate call for help, and now, the real challenge, the understanding of the enemy, the preparation for what was coming, was just beginning. Monroe felt a mixture of fear and anticipation. The quiet, horrifying realization of the threat had settled in, but so had a spark of resolve. They would have to confront the Deathworld Armada soon, and the outcome would depend on every decision, every action, and every ounce of courage they could summon. The simple call for help had awakened something much larger than a local emergency. It had revealed the presence of an enemy that could change the balance of power in the entire sector, and Monroe, with his team and the survivors, would be at the center of the struggle to survive, to protect, and perhaps to fight back in ways no one had imagined. After witnessing the devastation at the outpost and hearing the terrified accounts of the survivors, Monroe knew that a passive response would be fatal. This was no longer about simply rescuing a few stranded people. The entire colony and possibly nearby settlements faced a threat that could wipe them out if they didn't act quickly. Monroe immediately began coordinating a plan to rally every available force in the area. He understood that time was critical. The Deathworld Armada was ruthless and efficient, and they could strike again at any moment. The urgency of the situation pressed on his mind, but Monroe's experience had taught him that fear could not guide action. Only strategy, careful planning, and decisive leadership could save lives. He began by sending secure messages to nearby colonies, explaining the attack and requesting reinforcements. The messages had to be concise and clear, because the enemy's interference had made communication channels unreliable. Monroe's words were chosen with precision. Immediate aid needed. Outpost destroyed by hostile force. Enemy highly organized. Send all available ships and armed personnel. Even as he sent these messages, he knew that it might take hours, maybe longer, for reinforcements to arrive. Meanwhile, the survivors at the outpost were vulnerable, exhausted, and traumatized. Monroe's first task was to organize them into a defensive structure that could hold until backup arrived. He divided the survivors into groups based on their abilities. Engineers, who could work with machinery and improvised weapons, were assigned to repair damaged defenses and create barricades. Medics tended to the injured and organized supply distribution. Farmers and laborers were given roles in logistics, moving supplies, and keeping the pathways clear. Even children and teenagers were given small tasks that could contribute to the defense effort, spotting enemies, relaying messages, and moving essential supplies. Monroe's approach was methodical. Every person had a role, every action contributed to survival, and every step helped turn panic into purpose. Monroe then turned his attention to the enemy itself. From the survivors' accounts, he began mapping out the patterns of the Deathworld Armada. They struck with overwhelming force, landing from multiple directions at once, using both aerial and ground units. Their coordination was near flawless, and their weapons were far superior to anything the colonies had. Monroe studied the terrain carefully, noting choke points, natural barriers, and high ground that could be used to the colony's advantage. He realized that the only way to survive was to use the environment creatively, to force the enemy into positions where their numbers and technology could be neutralized, or at least slowed down. Over the course of the next several hours, Monroe and his team worked tirelessly, setting up defenses, reinforcing walls, and preparing for a potential counterattack. The survivors, initially trembling and silent, began to find a sense of determination. Monroe's calm but commanding presence reassured them that they weren't alone. He spoke to them often, explaining each step of the plan, showing them that every small action mattered. It wasn't just about fighting, it was about surviving together, using intelligence and strategy to face a seemingly unbeatable enemy. Monroe also took the time to personally train some of the volunteers. Many of them had never handled weapons before, but with quick, practical lessons, he taught them how to use rifles, pistols, and improvised defenses effectively. He emphasized accuracy, patience, and situational awareness. Don't just shoot randomly, he told them. Every shot counts. Every action you take can save a life. His words carried weight because he didn't just speak them, he demonstrated them, showing the survivors that even ordinary people could make a difference in a fight against overwhelming odds. As preparations continued, Monroe received intermittent updates from nearby colonies. A few ships were on their way, but the enemy's interference and distance meant that reinforcements would not arrive immediately. He knew he couldn't rely solely on outside help. The outpost and its survivors had to be able to defend themselves for several hours or even days until aid arrived. Monroe developed contingency plans for multiple scenarios: an all-out assault, a stealth infiltration, or an ambush from unexpected directions. He assigned specific teams to each task, ensuring that even if the worst happened, they would have a fighting chance. Despite the urgency and danger, Monroe also understood the importance of morale. Fear could spread quickly, and panic could ruin even the best-laid plans. He made sure to communicate constantly with the survivors, explaining what was happening and why each action was necessary. He shared small victories when barricades were successfully repaired or traps were set, reinforcing the idea that they were not helpless. Over time, the initial despair that had gripped the survivors began to shift into cautious determination. They saw that through organization, skill, and unity, they could face the unimaginable and still hold their ground, while preparing defenses. Monroe's team began gathering intelligence on the enemy's technology. Some fragments of their weapons and vehicles had been left behind during the initial attack, and his engineers worked tirelessly to analyze them. Every discovery was crucial. They learned, for example, that the enemy's energy weapons could be temporarily disrupted by certain reflective materials, or that their drones had a limited operational range. Monroe integrated this knowledge into their defense strategy, positioning barriers and traps in areas where they could have the greatest impact. Small advantages, carefully exploited, could turn the tide or at least prevent total disaster. As the sun set, the situation became more tense. Shadows stretched across the ruined outpost, and the eerie hum of distant machinery suggested that the Deathworld forces were still observing, waiting, and perhaps preparing for another strike. Monroe organized night patrols, ensuring that no area was left unchecked. He personally led one of the patrols, moving through the debris with practiced caution. Every sound, every flicker of light, every movement in the darkness could be a sign of danger. The team moved silently, communicating with hand signals and brief whispers, ready to react instantly if the enemy appeared. Even in these dire circumstances, Monroe found moments to inspire hope. He reminded the survivors of their resilience, of what they had already endured, and of the fact that their collective efforts could make a difference. He encouraged small acts of courage, praising those who took initiative, and reinforcing the idea that everyone mattered. This leadership style built trust and confidence among the survivors, making them more effective in both defense and communication. By the end of the first night, Monroe had transformed the outpost from a scene of chaos and destruction into a structured semi-defensible position. Barricades were in place, surveillance was set up, volunteers had defined roles, and intelligence on the enemy was steadily improving. Monroe knew that this was only a temporary measure. The Deathworld Armada was still out there, powerful and relentless, but the human spirit had proven its resilience. They had taken the first crucial steps in turning a hopeless situation into one where survival was possible. As the survivors rested in shifts, Monroe reflected on the scale of what was coming. The Deathworld forces had attacked not just to kill or steal. They had a plan, and it was a plan that threatened entire colonies. But he also recognized the strengths that had emerged from desperation. Ordinary people, faced with unimaginable danger, had begun to rise to the challenge. They had learned to cooperate, to fight, and to trust in one another, and in Monroe's leadership. The simple call for help had not only revealed the enemy, it had awakened courage, resourcefulness, and determination that would be essential in the battle ahead. Monroe remained vigilant through the night, monitoring the perimeter, coordinating patrols, and keeping the survivors prepared. He knew that the enemy could strike at any moment, and that preparedness was the only path to survival. As he looked out over the darkened landscape, he felt a mixture of caution and hope. They were facing an enemy unlike any they had encountered before. But through careful planning, unity, and courage, they had created a chance to survive. And in the quiet, tense hours before dawn, Monroe made a promise to himself and the survivors. No matter how overwhelming the Deathworld Armada appeared, they would fight with every resource, every strategy, and every ounce of courage they possessed. The simple call for help had set off a chain of events that would test every skill, every instinct, and every value they held. Monroe had taken the first steps toward organizing a defense. But the true challenge, confronting an unstoppable force with nothing but determination, intelligence, and unity, was only beginning. And in that challenge, the human spirit would face its ultimate test. The first clash with the Deathworld Armada began just as the pale light of dawn broke over the jagged horizon. Monroe and his team had been preparing for this moment all night, and now every bit of training, planning, and strategy would be tested. The survivors, though exhausted and frightened, were ready to defend what little remained of their outpost. The tension was thick, like static electricity in the air, and every creak of machinery, every distant hum, seemed amplified by fear and anticipation. Monroe stood at the center of the defensive line, eyes scanning the sky and the surrounding terrain, ready to make split-second decisions that could mean life or death. The first sign of the enemy was subtle at first, a flicker in the sky, a shadow passing across the ground, almost too quick to notice. Then, in a coordinated and terrifying motion, the Deathworld ships appeared, moving faster than anything the humans had ever seen. Their formations were precise, symmetrical, and intimidating, glinting metallically in the early morning light. Monroe's heart pounded, but he remained calm. He raised his hand, signaling his team to hold their fire until the enemy was within range. Every member of his team, every survivor, had been trained for this moment. Their focus was intense, each aware that hesitation could be fatal. As the first wave of enemy forces descended, the reality of the situation became horrifyingly clear. Laser blasts cut through the air, striking the ground near defensive barricades, sending showers of sparks and debris into the air. Explosions rocked the terrain, throwing dust and smoke into the sky and making it difficult to see. Ground units emerged from the enemy ship's mechanical constructs, fast and precise, moving with terrifying coordination. Monroe's team opened fire in unison, rifles and pistols blazing, while the improvised traps set up the night before were triggered. Some enemy machines were damaged, some destroyed, but many adapted, shifting their approach and finding new paths to advance. Monroe moved among his team, directing fire, repositioning survivors, and ensuring that everyone was doing their assigned tasks. The engineers operated portable energy shields and set up barriers where the enemy seemed to be concentrating. The medics ran tirelessly, moving from one injured person to another, patching wounds and calming terrified civilians. Monroe could see the fear on everyone's faces, but he also saw determination, ordinary people finding courage in the midst of chaos, rising to meet a threat that seemed almost unstoppable. The battle unfolded like a nightmare. The Deathworld units attacked relentlessly, waves of advanced machines and ships coordinated to overwhelm the defenders. Monroe's team used every advantage they had, the terrain, their knowledge of the outpost, and every improvised weapon and tactic they could muster. Explosions shattered the ground, sending clouds of dust into the air, and smoke from burning machinery made it difficult to see. But Monroe remained focused, moving between positions, issuing commands, and keeping morale high. Hold your positions. Use the terrain. Don't waste ammunition. Every shot counts, he shouted over the chaos, his voice cutting through the clamor like a beacon dot as the fight continued. Monroe noticed moments of brilliance from the survivors. Engineers used debris to create barricades that temporarily stopped advancing machines. Young volunteers spotted weak points in enemy formations, allowing Monroe to direct precise strikes that damaged several units. Civilians improvised, using farming tools and equipment to trigger traps, creating chaos in the enemy ranks. Even the medics, who were not trained fighters, took up defensive positions when necessary, helping to hold lines and cover retreats. It was not just Monroe's leadership, it was the emergence of a collective courage and intelligence that seemed almost instinctive in the face of the overwhelming danger. The sky was filled with flashes of light as enemy energy weapons met human firepower. Ships maneuvered in complex patterns, trying to find weak spots in the defenses. Ground units moved swiftly, attempting to flank Monroe's team. But the defenders anticipated some of these moves and had set traps in strategic locations. The battle was brutal and unforgiving. Every mistake could be deadly, and every decision carried immense weight. Monroe's tactical mind worked tirelessly, predicting enemy movements, adapting strategies, and coordinating responses in real time. It was a dance of chaos and precision, with life hanging in the balance at every moment. Despite the intensity of the battle, Monroe never let fear cloud his judgment. He knew that panic could spread faster than bullets, and that maintaining calm, decisive leadership was crucial. He encouraged every small victory, praising survivors for their bravery and skill. When a team successfully destroyed an enemy unit or held a critical position, Monroe made sure they knew it mattered. This approach bolstered morale and gave the defenders a sense of purpose amidst the overwhelming violence. Ordinary people, armed with determination and guided by strategy, were holding their ground against an enemy that seemed almost unstoppable. Hours passed, and the fighting showed no signs of slowing. Smoke and dust filled the air, obscuring visibility, and the constant barrage of energy fire created deafening noise. The outpost, already damaged, took further hits, and the ground shook with each explosion. Monroe's team adapted constantly, repositioning barriers, coordinating fire, and using the terrain to slow the enemy's advance. He had anticipated several patterns of attack and was able to counter some of them, but new strategies emerged from the Deathworld forces, testing his ability to think and react in real time. The battle was a trial of both physical endurance and mental agility. Amidst the chaos, Monroe saw moments of humanity and sacrifice. Volunteers ran into danger to save injured comrades. Engineers stayed behind to trigger traps, knowing they might be caught in the blast. Medics risked their lives repeatedly to reach the wounded, moving under a hail of fire. Even the youngest volunteers showed courage beyond their years, spotting weaknesses and taking action when adults hesitated. Monroe's respect for these people grew with each passing moment. He understood that courage was not the absence of fear, it was action in spite of it. As the sun climbed higher, the tide of the battle slowly began to shift. The Deathworld Armada, powerful as it was, had not anticipated the determination, intelligence, and unity of the human defenders. Every trap, every precise strike, and every coordinated defensive maneuver had a cumulative effect. Some enemy units were destroyed, others forced to retreat or reposition. Monroe and his team had learned to predict certain patterns and used this knowledge to their advantage. While the battle was far from over, the defenders were no longer just surviving, they were actively shaping the fight, turning defense into calculated offense. Monroe never let his team become complacent though. He constantly reminded them that the enemy was ruthless and that victory required vigilance. "This is not the end," he shouted. "Every wave counts. Every action matters. Stay sharp." The defenders moved with renewed energy, inspired by small successes and the knowledge that their efforts were making a difference, even amidst the fear and destruction. There was a sense of purpose, a belief that their courage and skill could protect lives and maybe even turn the tide. By late afternoon, the initial shock of the attack had passed, replaced by a focused determination. The Deathworld units continued to press forward, but Monroe's team had established stronger positions, reinforced barriers, and coordinated firing lines. They were weary, bruised, and bleeding, but they were holding. Monroe recognized that this battle was a test not only of strength and technology, but of resilience, unity, and human ingenuity. The survivors, once terrified and helpless, were now fighting with skill and coordination, each action contributing to the defense of their home. Even as the battle raged on, Monroe took a moment to reflect on what had been achieved. A simple call for help had sparked a confrontation that tested the limits of human courage. Ordinary people had become defenders, strategists, and heroes. They had risen to meet an enemy that seemed invincible, demonstrating that determination, adaptability, and unity could stand against overwhelming force. Monroe understood that this was only the beginning. The Deathworld Armada might regroup and return stronger, but the defenders had proven something critical. Even in the face of unimaginable odds, humanity could fight, endure, and survive. As the sun began to set, the fighting slowed temporarily, giving the defenders a brief moment to regroup. They tended to the wounded, repaired barricades, and communicated with nearby colonies to update them on the situation. Monroe moved among his team, checking on everyone, offering encouragement, and preparing for the next phase of the conflict. He knew that the battle had revealed weaknesses, but it had also revealed strengths both in strategy and in the human spirit. The first battle had been won, but it was clear that the war was far from over. Monroe understood that the Deathworld Armada would return, and they would likely come with even greater force. But for now, the defenders had survived. They had faced an enemy that seemed unstoppable and had held their ground. The simple call for help had ignited a response that demonstrated courage, intelligence, and unity in the face of unimaginable terror. Monroe's resolve hardened. He knew that the coming days would test them even further, but he also knew that together they had the strength to face whatever challenges lay ahead. When the dust finally settled, the landscape of the outpost was almost unrecognizable. The battle had left scars across the ground, craters from explosions, burnt-out wreckage of ships and machines, and the twisted remains of what had once been homes, supply depots, and defensive structures. Smoke still curled lazily from smoldering debris, and the acrid scent of burned metal and scorched earth hung heavy in the air. Monroe stood at the edge of the battlefield, his eyes sweeping across the destruction. Every detail told a story of fear, chaos, and struggle. Yet, amidst all this devastation, he could see something else: survival. Against all odds, the outpost had not been completely destroyed, and the people who had called for help were alive. That alone was a victory worth acknowledging. Even if the cost had been enormous, Monroe walked among the survivors, noting the mix of relief, exhaustion, and grief etched into their faces. Some were injured but alive. Others were shaken but unharmed physically. Every person carried the weight of what they had endured. Children clung to their parents, engineers inspected damaged equipment with wary hands, and medics moved tirelessly among the injured, their energy spent but unbroken. Monroe's heart was heavy with the loss he knew had occurred: friends, neighbors, and perhaps family members who had not survived the initial assault. Yet at the same time, he felt a sense of awe at the resilience displayed by everyone who remained. Ordinary people had faced the unimaginable and had not only survived, they had fought back. As the survivors began to gather in safer zones, Monroe worked quickly to establish temporary shelters and basic medical facilities. Reinforcements from nearby colonies had begun to arrive, their ships touching down cautiously amid the still tense air. Monroe coordinated with them, providing intelligence on the enemy, pointing out potential weak spots, and briefing them on the survivors' needs. The reinforcements were skilled, but they had never seen the devastation caused by the Deathworld Armada at such close range. Monroe's calm yet authoritative guidance allowed them to integrate quickly into the ongoing recovery efforts, strengthening the colony's defense while providing aid to those affected. Even in the aftermath, Monroe remained vigilant. He knew that the Deathworld Armada was not finished. They had attacked with overwhelming force once, and they could very well return, better prepared and more determined. Every patrol, every sensor, and every defensive position needed to remain active. Monroe organized continuous monitoring of the surrounding terrain, establishing lookout posts and communication relays, to ensure that any signs of a returning threat would be detected as early as possible. While the battle had been won, the war was far from over. Preparation and foresight were now as vital as courage and skill had been during the fight. Despite the danger, Monroe allowed himself a moment to reflect on what had transpired. He thought about the survivors, the bravery they had shown, and the ingenuity they had demonstrated under extreme pressure. Engineers had repaired broken defenses using scraps of machinery. Medics had risked their lives repeatedly to save others. And even children and teenagers had played crucial roles, running messages, spotting weak points, and alerting adults to enemy movements. The collective courage had been extraordinary. Monroe realized that the simple call for help had not only triggered a rescue, it had awakened a spirit of resilience and unity that might otherwise have remained dormant. Monroe also reflected on the sacrifices made during the battle. Some survivors had been lost, and their absence was felt deeply by everyone present. He moved among the wounded, offering words of encouragement and practical help, making sure that no one felt abandoned. He reminded everyone that grief was natural, but they could honor those lost by continuing to protect and rebuild their community. It was a delicate balance, acknowledging pain while fostering hope, mourning loss while inspiring action. Monroe's leadership extended beyond tactics. It was about sustaining the human spirit even when surrounded by destruction. The reinforcements began to integrate fully into the outpost. Experienced soldiers shared their knowledge with the survivors, teaching improved defensive strategies and reinforcing the barricades. Engineers worked alongside local volunteers to repair damaged vehicles and communication devices. Medics set up triage areas and organized supplies, ensuring that even the most vulnerable had access to care. Monroe oversaw every operation, coordinating efforts efficiently so that the outpost could recover as quickly as possible. Every action contributed to the rebuilding of not just the infrastructure, but also the confidence and morale of the people who had endured so much as the hours passed. Monroe gathered the survivors for a briefing. He spoke calmly, deliberately, explaining what had happened, what they had achieved, and what challenges remained. "You've faced an enemy unlike any we've seen before," he said. "You've shown courage, skill, and resilience that I could never have imagined. But we must remain vigilant. This is not the end, but today we celebrate survival, and tomorrow we prepare for whatever comes next." His words were met with nods, quiet murmurs of agreement, and a renewed determination. In that moment, the survivors understood that they had been part of something significant, that their actions mattered, and that their courage had made a difference. Monroe then walked through the outpost, inspecting the repairs and assessing what resources were available. Supplies were limited, and every decision about distribution had to be made carefully. He prioritized food, medical supplies, and energy sources for defensive equipment, ensuring that critical needs were met first. He also began planning for longer-term recovery, knowing that the battle had left the colony vulnerable. Repairing infrastructure, securing the perimeter, and rebuilding homes and facilities would take time, effort, and cooperation. Monroe understood that rebuilding was not just a logistical challenge, it was a psychological one. People needed to feel safe again, to regain trust in their environment and in one another. During this time, Monroe also worked to gather intelligence on the Deathworld Armada. Fragments of their technology, captured units, and residual energy signatures were analyzed carefully. The engineers and scientists who had joined from nearby colonies helped Monroe understand patterns in the enemy's attacks, weaknesses in their armor and weapons, and possible strategies they might employ if they returned. This information was crucial. It gave the defenders a chance to prepare for the next encounter. Monroe realized that understanding the enemy was as important as physical defenses. Knowledge could be a weapon, just as deadly as any rifle or trap. Even as planning continued, Monroe never lost sight of the human element. He spent time talking to survivors, listening to their experiences, and acknowledging their bravery. He recognized that many were traumatized, and he encouraged open communication, allowing people to express fear, grief, and frustration. Monroe believed that emotional resilience was as important as physical survival. By giving people space to process what had happened, he helped them regain a sense of agency and control. The battle had been terrifying, but it had also shown them that they could survive, fight back, and protect one another. By the end of the day, the outpost had begun to regain a sense of order. Temporary shelters had been reinforced, medical care was organized, and patrols maintained vigilance over the perimeter. Survivors were tired, but their spirits were not broken. Monroe moved through the camp one last time before nightfall, observing the quiet determination in the faces of those who had fought so hard. He felt a mixture of pride, relief, and somber reflection. The battle had tested every limit, physical, mental, and emotional, but the people had endured. They had faced an enemy that seemed invincible and had survived through courage, intelligence, and unity. As night fell, Monroe allowed himself a rare moment of contemplation. He thought about the journey that had begun with a simple call for help, a faint signal that could have been ignored or dismissed. That single moment had set in motion a chain of events that revealed the true character of the people he was leading. Ordinary individuals had become defenders, strategists, and heroes. They had faced a terrifying enemy, adapted under extreme pressure, and discovered strength they might not have known existed. Monroe understood that this experience would stay with them forever. The outpost, the survivors, and even the landscape bore witness to their courage. Despite the relative calm of the evening, Monroe's mind remained focused on the future. He knew that the Deathworld Armada could return, that new challenges would arise, and that vigilance would always be necessary. But he also knew that the colony had been transformed. The survivors had proven that they could fight, endure, and rebuild. They had learned to trust one another, to act decisively under pressure, and to adapt in ways that made them formidable even against overwhelming odds. Monroe believed that this strength born from adversity would be the key to facing any future threats. Finally, Monroe gathered the survivors together for a closing moment of recognition. He spoke of the bravery, resourcefulness, and resilience they had shown. He reminded them that, even in the face of unimaginable danger, their courage and unity had made a difference. "We may have lost much," he said, "but we have also gained something far more valuable: the knowledge that we are capable of surviving, of protecting each other, and of standing strong when the odds seem impossible. Today, we honor those we lost, we care for those who remain, and we prepare for whatever comes next. We are human, and that is our greatest strength." The survivors listened, their faces a mixture of relief, sorrow, and determination. In that moment, the simple call for help that had sparked this ordeal had revealed more than the presence of an enemy. It had revealed the courage, ingenuity, and unity of ordinary people when faced with extraordinary danger. Monroe knew that the colony would continue to rebuild, that defenses would grow stronger, and that the human spirit had been tested unproven beyond measure.